And to round out our session, we have Dr. Elizabeth Smith, a research meteorologist at NOAA's National Severe Storms Laboratory, and she'll be talking about taking care of your sensors, obtaining and retaining a sense of self when the stakes feel high.
All right, so we're going to talk about our sense of self, how we know it, how we take care of it, even when stakes are high, and when the pressure is on. So in addition to my main research capacity at NSSL, I also work with students through my affiliation at OU. And another part of my identity it may be important to know as we embark on this conversation is that I'm a first-generation college student and graduate. Before we get into this, there's a few things I want to go over. First, I am not trained in psychology or any related science. Information that I share here is from my own research and my lived experiences. I'm not an expert. Some of the topics that we'll discuss here are closely tied to our identity and how we are perceived in the world around us. Factors like race, gender, sexual orientation, they all play huge and complex roles in this, and I'm not aiming to minimize or ignore the importance of any of these factors. I do also recognize that the full complexity of these factors cannot be fully treated in a 12-minute conversation, so I do want to just mention that up front. We're going to discuss the inner self, and the inner self includes the sense of self, your self-esteem, and self-efficacy, which has been kind of a thread that we've talked about through all of the discussions so far. And those make up the full understanding of yourself. The sense of self, which is also sometimes called the self-concept, is the overall idea of who you think you are. And it's built up in a few ways. It's built up in how you interact with others, how others respond to you, and how we compare ourselves in terms of superiority or similarity. Self-esteem is made up of the judgments that we make of our sense of self. It's honestly an evaluation of the sense of self. Self-efficacy is kind of a step further. That is coming from our sense of self, or self-esteem. It's a judgment that we ourselves pass on our ability to do something in a specific context or our capability. So these three components are intertwined and they can feed back on each other. So you can think about it as our self-efficacy impacting our self-esteem, and it shapes maybe how we think of ourselves. Our self-esteem can change our assessment of that self-efficacy and can shape our sense of self. And then our sense of self is defined by and defines our self-esteem and by extension, our self-efficacy. So I'd like you to take a quick second and check in on yourself and reflect. And this is a private reflection. I'm not going to ask you to share with anybody. How established is your sense of self? How's it doing? Is your sense of self deeply rooted in your studies or in your work? Steve touched on this at the beginning here today. We're going to come back to that. Is that healthy for you? Our sense of self can be impacted by threats, both real and perceived. And that takes up a lot of energy and effort to deal with and can wreak havoc on our self-esteem and our self-efficacy. For example, stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a psychological phenomena that occurs when individuals become aware that their behavior, perception, appearance, etc., could confirm a negative stereotype that's associated with an aspect of their identity. So I identify as a white woman, so I'm going to provide an example that sets with my identity. So a stereotype threat for me, and one that shows up often in the literature, would be that women are oftentimes stereotyped as being lesser at mathematics. So imagine that I'm entering into a mathematics exam, and beyond my own perhaps fears or preparation for that exam, I'm made aware of if I do poorly on this mathematics exam, I might confirm for whoever's grading that exam that stereotype that women are just lesser in math. Research has shown that stereotype threat, that threat, can, if it's real or perceived, actually reduces our ability to learn and reduces the very basic executive functioning that's happening inside of our brains. It's also been shown that if you're feeling like, maybe to combat that threat, that you need to go and do more, go above and beyond to show that you're capable, that you're using a lot of excess energy. And this really opens you up to burnout. And this is just one example of a type of threat that we're open to that can impact our self-esteem and our sense of self. There are other types of threats, and I welcome you to, join me as we talk about these. These types of threats can really get at our sense of self and our self-esteem. So if you feel comfortable doing it, you can raise your hand. You don't feel obligated to do so. But has your sense of self or self-esteem ever been threatened by failure? How about the threat of rejection? Has your self-esteem or sense of self been threatened by being excluded? How about the threat of being singled out? And then here comes the big one, the threat of being discovered as the imposter, right? So these threats are really big. They're real, they impact all of us, and these threats take up a lot of energy. The way that we're trying to dodge these threats and make sure that they're not getting to us, thank you, by the way, for sharing that with us. They spend a lot of energy, they impact our self-efficacy, how we evaluate our capabilities. They can influence our self-esteem, and they really get that self-critic voice going, right? Which brings us to the self-esteem paradigm. Often we are getting into that voice in our head all the time, right? And we're saying things to ourselves that we would never say to someone we cared about. Oftentimes we're saying things to ourselves in our heads that we would never say to someone that we despise. We're so often in the habit of talking to ourselves this way that we don't even realize the incredible amount of pain that we're causing to ourselves and how we're destroying our own self-esteem. We're even causing ourselves sometimes to lose that true sense of who we are, our sense of self. So why do we do it? Right? That self-criticism. If self-criticism is so damaging to our self-esteem and to our sense of self, why are we doing it? So research is being done here, and what that research says is that we think that we need to be so self-critical in order to motivate ourselves, right? We think that if we only talked nicely to ourselves, we would be lazy and self-indulgent, and we need to speak so critically to ourselves to motivate ourselves to do better, to be more. However, the opposite is actually true. It's actually demotivating. For example, after so much criticism and devaluating yourself, you can enter what's called the prevention focus, where you question your capability so much to complete a task without making mistakes, you end up expending so much energy on avoiding those mistakes that you might not have made in the first place, that you're doing that instead of allowing yourself to actually do whatever it is that you're meant to do with your full capability and creativity and imagination. And instead, you're just focused on the not making mistakes because of yourself. You're in your own way, essentially. And this is called prevention focus. This is a real thing that people are researching. And we're doing it to ourselves. Talk about burnout, right? And I would imagine that some of you have experienced this in your lives. I know that I have. So this brings us to one big problem with self-esteem. It's contingent, right? It's contingent on success. What happens when we don't succeed? What happens when we fail? What happens when we don't live to our ideal standards? Self-esteem leaves us feeling really lousy, right, when we don't make it to our ideal standard that we are trying to live up to. Which brings us to some of the bigger problems with the self-esteem paradigm. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience. In my own case, my sense of self being connected to success led down a path of pressure to change or conform, to maybe get ahead or to fit in. And for me, this meant that I felt pressure as soon as I entered college to train myself out of the accent that I had from my background. I'm originally from the state of West Virginia, and I had an accent from there. And I felt very real concern when I went to college that having that accent would mean that I would be marked as different, as whatever connotations come with that. I regret this today. It is a part of my identity that is lost forever. I also realized the very real privilege that I had to make that choice. I could choose to train myself out of an accent. That is an identity choice that I could make. A lot of people don't have that. This is a reminder to all of us, especially those of us in any sort of position to affect change, that our words and our actions as individuals and as institutions matter. Words and actions matter. Representation matters. With my own example, I had only ever seen negative connotation and representation people from West Virginia. So I acted to remove it from my identity. It's taken a lot of growth and unlearning to see that for what it is now. On the more psychological side, we know that low self-esteem is problematic, right? But interestingly, high self-esteem can be problematic too. So in American culture, we know that to have high self-esteem, you're supposed to be special, right? And you're above average. So what if I looked at you guys all and I said that based on my assessment of being here in the room today, this was a pretty average student conference? And I expect that based on just kind of looking around the room today, I expect your posters will be probably pretty average. Yeah, right? So that's kind of an insult, right? So if all of us are expected to be above average all the time, meteorology is a pretty math-adjacent field, right? What's the problem if all of us in this room are expected to be above average? That math doesn't work, does it? So to get there, other people take some action sometimes and put each other down, right? I mean, this is some pretty basic stuff that we were taught in elementary school, right? It sounds like bullying, doesn't it? But this is actually what's happening. Psychologists have been tracking for the last 25 years narcissism level in college undergraduates, and we're at the highest levels right now. So self-esteem, even when it's high, has some pretty big problems. So in this paradigm, if we are trying to get our self-esteem high, we're chasing it, we're maybe even willing, like me, to blindly erase parts of our identity to get there. If our self-esteem is already high, to keep it, we're just going to keep putting each other down. Narcissistic behavior? Who even are we, right? Why are we doing this? What is driving our behavior? And what is the purpose? To get the job, to pass the class, to do well in the interview, to get into grad school? What is the point of all of this, right? So this is what some of the problems are with the self-esteem paradigm. And this is where self-compassion enters as an alternative to the paradigm. So self-esteem or self-compassion as an alternative sounds silly when you see it. I mean, it's so simple. But Dr. Kristin Neff, she is associate faculty at UT Austin. She and her colleagues have been publishing on this scientifically since 2003, a very real thing. And the three main tenets of self-compassion are clear, treat ourselves with kindness versus harsh self-judgment. Recognize that the experience of suffering, failure, and inadequacy is part of what people have in common as a shared human experience. Pain literally happens to everyone. It is unique in how it happens. There are, some very different reasons why suffering is happening to people, and that is important to recognize. But we do have the shared experience of pain and suffering. We can share that. and being mindful enough as individuals to actually acknowledge and validate our own suffering and give ourselves compassion. And so what that takes is interrupting that self-criticism that's going on in your brain and probably some maladaptive coping strategies that you have going on there long enough to be able to stop and say, hey, like, I'm actually suffering. I feel bad, and I know it. Self-compassion offers the benefits of self-esteem without the pitfalls. It's associated with strong mental health, but not narcissistic habits, constant social comparison, or any of that ego-aggressive behavior. But it also provides much more stable sense of self-worth. And it provides everything that you need, especially when you fail. Just when self-esteem is out the door, self-compassion is there with a sense of being valuable, not because you succeeded and not because you've evaluated yourself positively, but because you are a human worthy of love just for being you in that moment. And you know that about yourself. And that's what self-compassion is all about. Now, I realize that I have just introduced this concept, this self-compassion paradigm, with very little in the way of what to do with it, and that is a bit intentional. I am not properly trained to be your guide in how to be self-compassionate because, in the interest of full disclosure, I am a work in progress. There are some QR codes up on the screen. The one on the far left is a test, so you can test your own self-compassion. You take that test later, I will share with you that I got a 2.2, so you can find out what that means. I am a work in progress. There are some additional resources available at the other QR codes on the screen. My Twitter handle and my email are available there as well. I will be here all week. I encourage you to be compassionate to yourselves and to each other. Life is hard enough as it is. The world's a difficult place. And that's all I have.